So can you just provide us some really snapshot of the historical aspects of how much Poland, back into the Hungarian-Austrian sort of expenditure there, Poland used to have the western side of Ukraine under its territory?
Yeah, what we call today Western Ukraine was for a long time part of the Polish kingdom, then the Second Rzeczpospolita, or the Second Republic, and as a result of the decisions made at Yalta by Stalin and the American president and Winston Churchill, the big three, so to say, that land was ceded back to the Ukrainian SSR, Soviet Socialist Republic, and Poland, as a compensation, was given by Stalin what we Poles consider to be our historic lands. The Germans consider their German historic lands, basically the Western Wall, so Silesia and Western Pomerania. But if we really want to do a deep dive into Polish-Ukrainian relations, we probably have to go back, all the way back, I think, even to the 10th century, in essence, which is basically a long line of two ethnic groups, and after a while, even two religious groups, trying to find a sort of commonality under the rule of an ostensibly Polish monarch and a Polish regime. Now, with the Polish partitions, which took place in the latter half of the 18th century, the Ukrainian question, or at that time, which was called the Ruthenian question, because Ukraine as a word is a fairly modern construct. Before the word Ukraine was created, or Ukrainian, we would refer to people living directly to the east of Poland, southeast of Poland, as Ruthenians, or Rus, Ruthenia, basically, and Kiev obviously being the spiritual capital of what was then Ruthenia, and even what today is Russia, as Moscow claims that the historical roots of contemporary Russia, especially in its ethnic and spiritual dimension, began in Kiev with Prince Vladimir, to many Saint Vladimir. But in a nutshell, if we were to look at the most consequential aspects of today's situation, how they relate to history, we would probably have to go back to the 1930s, when Ukrainian nationalism, within the framework of the Second Republic of Poland, which incorporated at that time significant parts of today's Western Ukraine, including the major cities like Lvov, there was a rise in Ukrainian nationalism led by such people as Stepan Bandera and ideologues such as Roman Shukhevych, who basically advocated for the creation of what they called Wielka Ukraina, Greater Ukraine, which would incorporate not only the historical Ruthenian lands of today's Western Ukraine, or Galicia as some call it, but also expanses into from the Ukrainian perspective, into the west, so taking into account Polish cities such as Przemyśl, which you might have known as you visited the border, and Chełm, also in the Lublin province. So these nationalists basically became a very organized force. They started using terrorist tactics. As a matter of fact, Bandera was convicted for the assassination of a Polish minister during the interwar period. He actually went to jail. And fast forward to 1939, we have the arrival of the Wehrmacht in Poland on 17 September 1939. The Soviets come in, and all of a sudden, the Third Reich begins to see these Ukrainian nationalists as useful tools in not only keeping the Poles sort of under control, but also in promulgating their anti-Soviet policy in the East. And starting around 1943, we began to see in what's called Volhynia in today's Western Ukraine, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or UPA as it was called, begin a campaign of ethnic cleansing, literally ethnic cleansing. They believed that the Poles, and especially the Polish landowners, the aristocracy who ruled Western Ukraine for a long time, were occupiers. They needed to be expelled by force if needed. And they conducted a campaign of mass genocide that that makes, Somalia, Yugoslavia, the Hutu and the Tutsi, with all due respect to the victims, but look like a walk in the park. I mean, the level of barbarism that was seen in the Volhynia massacre, and what these monsters really were able to do to another human being is horrifying. I encourage everyone to Google Volhynia massacre to read up on what happened. There's actually a fairly good movie which came out a few years ago. It's called Volyn by producer Wojciech Smarzowski. I think it's already with English subtitles for some time now. I think you could stream it. Really goes to show what happened in a land where for ages Poles and Ukrainians were living as neighbors, literally side by side. You know, you'd have Polish Christmas being celebrated in one house in the same village, and Ukrainian Christmas. You'd have two Christmases celebrated every year, because obviously you have the two different Christian calendars. You have the Orthodox calendar, Eastern calendar, Roman Catholic calendar. And all of a sudden, people who were neighbors for ages, under the influence of this insurgent Ukrainian ideology of greater Ukraine, nationalism, and a pure-blooded Ukraine, they started killing the Poles off. And obviously, it's worth mentioning here that it wasn't only the Poles who suffered. We had a huge component of Jews that were killed at the same time. Other Ukrainians who tried to save their Polish neighbors, so we would call them, you know, as the Jews called those goyim who saved the Jews during World War II, the righteous among the nations. And I think that's very important to point out how many fellow Ukrainians were the victims of Ukrainian nationalism, which is something which I don't think anybody in Kiev today wants to mention, but that's just a historical fact. And other minorities that also suffered at the hands of Bandera and his henchmen. So this ethnic cleansing campaign, it's estimated, claimed the lives of around 200,000 Poles. That's a crazy number. It's horrifying. And these campaigns continued after the war. What happened was, when the Polish People's Republic, the Polish communist state, was established after 1945, the government took a very tough stance to cleanse the southeastern part of Poland, or what is where you were in Przemyśl, of the remnants of the insurgent militias. So what happened was, in 1947, they conducted this operation. It was called Operation Vistula, whereby, in order to deprive the Ukrainian insurgent army, the militias, of their local support, a huge deportation campaign occurred, where they took Ukrainians from southeastern Poland and they transported them to western Poland, northwestern Poland. So especially to three provinces of Lower Silesia, where I'm based, Western Pomerania, and the Mazura regions, which is basically northeastern Poland, right there, just beside historical Prussia, and on the border beside Lithuania and Belarus. So those three areas, they dispersed them because the insurgents were relying on the local Ukrainian population, you know, to feed them, to hide them. They sort of lost their base of operations. And by the 1950s, they were crushed. Now, Stepan Bandera was obviously assassinated by a KGB agent in Munich in the early 1950s, and the Ukrainians dispersed all over the world, and they began to conduct anti-Soviet operations from abroad, while having some willing agents obviously on the ground in Ukraine, with the help of the Central Intelligence Agency. And if you visit the archive of the CIA, currently online, at least the declassified parts, but these aspects already have been declassified. There's a huge base of documents detailing about how the CIA, despite knowing that the Banderites from Bandera, that these Ukrainian nationalists collaborated with Adolf Hitler's Germany, they were seen as useful tools in conducting an anti-Soviet foreign policy, diversionary tactics in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, and obviously propaganda operations that were financed by the CIA, promoted by the CIA, under the umbrella of the major Ukrainian organization, which I think was called the Ukrainian World Congress. And obviously, if you take into account the diaspora of Ukrainians in Canada and in the United States, they found fertile ground where they can conduct these anti-Soviet operations, while at the same time remaining loyal to the cause of Ukrainian nationalism.
Wow. Wasn't and correct me on this, Mike. Wasn't Lviv used to be the capital for when Poland was taking over the western part, based on some historical records that I read? Before,
you mean
yes, before
you mean
Kiev became the capital.
Well, Lviv wasn't. It was a major city. It wasn't officially a capital, although it was considered. Okay. It was sort of a subset in a way, because Lviv was obviously a very important cultural and educational and spiritual hub. So it was. I would say it was very close to becoming a capital. Obviously, in our history, We've run on 3 capitals. We had Gniezno, Krakow, and obviously now Warsaw. So it had the potential, but it was always, most of the time, just basically a major metropolitan center, with Kiev remaining as the sort of bedrock city and the capital of Ukrainian identity.
Oh, okay. I just, because I remembered and I kept it in mind, and I said, well, when I have a conversation with Mike, I'm gonna just mention and ask you, because you're a historian, and I trust your inputs in all this. Now let me put my geopolitical analyst hat on, and I am gonna just think, and this is me thinking out loud. If I am to go back in history, we'll think about the aftermath of the World War II. You know, how the decision was made to partisan or to divide, or rather, the spoils of the war after the defeat of the Nazis. So, can we see? This is just hypothetical, Mike. Can we see the same outcome currently with the conflict in Ukraine, if we are to say this is how this conflict is going to be settled? The eastern part of Ukraine, it's gone, is under Russian control. The central part of the country is under Kiev, and the western part, it will be divided between Poland, Hungary, and Romania to a degree. Am I thinking? Am I like crazy thinking this way?
No, I wouldn't say you're crazy. I think it's in the realm of the possible. At this stage, though, I think it's in the realm of unlikely. Now,
Okay.
I think that obviously Crimea, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk, that's over. That's never coming back to Ukraine.
Yeah.
The open question now is what's going to happen with Kharkov and Odessa. I'm hearing sort of 2 versions of people who consider themselves to be on Russia's side about what should happen. So one side is saying, enough of the attrition, enough of the meat grinding. Let's cross the river. Let's move into Odessa and let's end this. Now, for understandable reasons, you would want the war to end as quickly as possible because people are dying on both sides. And whereas the Ukrainians are dying in the hundreds of thousands, the Russians are also dying in lesser numbers, but they're still dying. Coffins are coming home. Fathers aren't coming back. Sons are coming back, and so on. So that's one side. The other side says, no, we need to continue the attrition to wear down the Ukrainian military, to basically destroy it, because this is on par with the statement, the mission statement, if you will, which was made by Vladimir Putin when he announced the SMO, when he said, we're going to demilitarize Ukraine, i.e. demilitarize, you destroy the fighting capacity of the Ukrainian armed forces, the VCU. So in my opinion, the open question is now, and I'm seeing both of these sides, debate each other in a way. It's a question of how far Putin will go and what will happen in the next couple of weeks. Now, I believe that the major combat potential of the Third Army, which NATO has built for Ukraine, should end sometime, I think, in the middle of September. And then God knows what's going to happen then. Either the Russians are going to move, cross the Dnieper, and move down into Odessa. But we can't forget that being powerful as they are, that's going to take way more, well, maybe not way more, but more men than they have right now under arms for an offensive. I can't give you the rough number right now. I refer to better experts as Scott Ritter or Doug McGregor, for example. But just looking at the map and looking at the expanse of Ukrainian territory, you're going to need a lot more men. And I think Putin is aware of that. However, the western part of Ukraine, that's an open question. Now, I know I was on Redacted with Clayton Morris a few days ago. He asked me the same question. Are the rumors of Poland entering Ukraine true? Now, I liaise with a lot of people in Polish politics, the Polish parliament, the sort of blogosphere, some people who used to serve in the Polish security intelligence services. And I could tell your audience that as of today, I am not seeing any signs that anybody in Poland is seriously considering an incursion into Ukraine. But if you consider that the parliamentary elections are on October 15th, we can't rule out what will happen after October 15th. Now, knowing how irrational and devoid of any real strategic thinking this government is, I wouldn't rule it out in toto, because the main line that's being propounded by a lot of these commentators is that Poland and Lithuania would enter Ukraine and set up a sort of security zone, which in essence would amount to a formal occupation. And I think it was Shoigu who made a statement today or yesterday where he basically outlined what the Russians think will happen in Western Ukraine. The Belarusian president has already said he's not going to allow that because an entrance of Polish forces or NATO forces, even if they're not entering under an official NATO article, when they enter Western Ukraine, that's going to be a southern threat to Belarus. And Lukashenko said he's not going to allow that. So that already opens a second front with our other neighbor in Minsk. The Hungarians, I think they're playing the long game. Obviously, Hungary doesn't have the military capacity to do much in Ukraine. But I think they're taking a tough political stance in the sense that, like, for example, they are asking the question, why is the Hungarian minority in overwhelming numbers being drafted to fight in eastern Ukraine, while a lot of other Ukrainians from the same regions are just buying themselves off through the recruiting office and, for example, escaping to Western Europe or Poland. So that doesn't seem fair to them, even though they're Ukrainian citizens, but they're asking these questions. We're not allowed to ask, well, for 2 weeks now, we're allowed to ask questions about Ukraine and Poland, but 2 weeks ago, it wasn't popular, so you weren't allowed to say anything because you were under the influence of the Kremlin. So I think all in all, as of today, I don't see any incursion from Poland into Ukraine. I don't see it for sure before October 15th.
Yeah.
And I think the more important question is, because I think possible moves by Poland will be based on what the Russians do. Will the Russians continue the meat grinder in eastern Ukraine, whereby this Ukrainian counteroffensive is just, well, it's sad because people are dying, but it's a joke at the end of the day. And will Putin decide to cross the Dnieper and to make a move that will decisively be a knockout blow to the Kiev regime, force them to the table, or potentially force somebody to knock out Zelensky in Kiev for the Russians, and who will immediately, drive his jeep to the negotiating tent and sit down with General Armageddon to negotiate capitulation terms. So, as of today, anything is possible.
Yeah. Well, even for the Canadian president Zelensky, he doesn't have any say into what's going on. We all know this. I mean, it's nothing new that he's like. When I had the conversation with Scott Ritter, and he was spot on when he said, "Look, he's been given the script." And he just read from it, basically. That's how.
Well, he's an actor, right? He's used to reading from a script.
After all,
Yeah.
You're right. But just my point about this particular aspect that you just covered, my thinking is about the settlement. This is why I was thinking in terms of when the United States, NATO, general, whatever, and the Soviet or the Russian rather decide to sort of enter into peace, could that Western part be given to Poland somehow as something? It's just me thinking outside the box.
The interesting thing about there's a rumor going around that, and it's never been confirmed by Poland's former Prime Minister Donald Tusk, but apparently I think it was Radek Sikorski, the former Polish foreign minister and currently husband of Anne Applebaum, by the way. He once said that apparently in 2010, when Tusk and Putin had their meeting, Putin was apparently suggesting that, we recognize that Lvov is a historically Polish city. We recognize that Western Ukraine has a lot to do with Poland. Can you take a hint? Wink, wink.
Yes,
basically. Yes. And this was 2010. This is, 3 years before the Maidan revolt. Yeah. So apparently it was discussed then. Now, as I said, that's unverified. Sikorski said it once. I don't think Tusk ever verified that, or the Kremlin, but, we can't rule it out. However, if you look at his recent statement where he had that public discussion with Lukashenko, he came back to that theme. He said that, we're not really interested in Western Ukraine because why would we want a region, infested with Ukrainian nationalism? I mean, that would give us another Afghanistan. We don't want another Afghanistan. We're not interested in Western Ukraine. And oh, by the way, it was part of Poland for a long time. And apparently the Poles are thinking of going in. But notice that he never said, if Poland were to take these territories back, we would do something in that regard. It was Lukashenko who suggested that the Belarusians won't like it. But Putin basically was suggesting, if you guys want to go in and partition Ukraine, that part, go ahead. Knock yourself out. If you want that problem or that headache, knock yourself out. Now, as a Pole, I can tell you right now, there's a lot of sentiment for the so-called borderlands, because a lot of people in Poland today, descendants of the ones who came to Poland and were deported from what is today Western Ukraine after 1945 to Poland proper. There's a sentiment, you know, Poland from sea to sea, we can regain our historical territories and so on. But people don't realize, I don't think, that taking Western Ukraine and rebuilding it to a viable economic entity is probably something much larger than integrating the former DDR into the German Federal Republic. It's going to take a lot of money. It's going to take a lot of policing. It's going to take up a lot of human capital. And I don't think we have the stomach or the money or the human capital to do that. I think it would just be insane. It would be like incorporating, I don't know, Somalia to the richest state in the United States in terms of economy and corruption. It's a whole different ballgame. It would literally tie us down for years just to try and rebuild Western Ukraine into something more viable. Let's not forget, it was actually Eastern Ukraine, because people laugh that, you know, Eastern Ukraine is the more Soviet part of Ukraine because you have the Soviet, many of the Russians. Yeah, sure. But in terms of economic power, the economic power that Ukraine had came from Odessa, access to the Black Sea, and from the minerals and the resources that were in the Donbass, not from Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine basically has, you know, fertile land that Monsanto is buying out and BlackRock is taking over, but nothing much else. And a lot of Ukrainian nationalists who hate Poland, by the way. So we would only be incorporating a headache. And maybe that was one of the reasons that Putin was suggesting to us, you know, if, hey, we'd rather you pacify Western Ukraine for us than forcing our hand to move all the way to the Polish border. So there is some logic to that. But fortunately, even in that regard, I'm not seeing anybody seriously in Poland discussing an incursion into Western Ukraine and even setting up a security zone. But everybody knows that it would be an occupational zone and a permanent occupation that would basically transpire into incorporation after some time.
Well, so great to hear.